I was in Lisbon when my water tower got demolished, not damaged, not vandalized, not even accidentally clipped by some idiot in a bulldozer. I mean, completely wiped off the map, like it had never existed in the first place. One afternoon, it was standing there on the highest corner of my orchard, rust-red steel frame, catching the late sun like it always had, the quiet backbone of my irrigation system. And 3 days later, I get a photo from my neighbor, and it's just dirt. Flat dirt, twisted metal, and a temporary construction fence where my tower used to be. Now, the strange part isn't that someone demolished it. The strange part is that they did it while I was out of the country, and they seemed pretty confident I wouldn't be able to do a damn thing about it. Let me rewind a little. My place sits outside a small town in Northern California, the real kind of rural, not the Instagram version. 40 acres of old orchard land my grandfather started planting back in the 70s. Apricots, almonds, a few stubborn walnut trees that refuse to die even during drought years. It's the kind of land that looks peaceful until you realize every single tree is basically part of a giant machine. Pumps, valves, pressure lines, underground pipes running everywhere. And right at the top corner of that property sat the water tower. It wasn't pretty. No tourist was pulling over to photograph it. The thing looked like it came out of an agricultural museum. Steel legs, cylindrical tank, faded ladder bolted along the side. But that tower was doing 3 very important jobs whether anyone noticed or not. It stabilized pressure across the entire irrigation grid. It stored reserve water during peak draw. And it kept the main pumps from burning themselves to death every time we hit a hot week in July. Take that tower out of the system, and suddenly your irrigation becomes a guessing game. Pressure spikes, pipes strain, valves misbehave, and crops start stressing out real fast. Before I left the country for a 3-week consulting job, infrastructure planning, boring stuff, but it pays well, I did what I always do. Walk the property, check the pumps, check the tower gauge, confirmed permits were still valid. And that part matters, because that tower wasn't new construction. It had been there since long before the housing development behind my land even existed. Back then the area was nothing but ranch parcels and open scrubland. Then about 8 years ago a developer showed up. You've probably seen the type. Slick website, inspirational names like Silver Ridge Estates or Oak Meadow Preserve, giant banners showing smiling families walking golden retrievers through perfectly landscaped streets. Except when you actually drive past the site, it's just bulldozers and dust. The company building behind my orchard called their project Hawthorne Gates. Gated community, 200 homes, private roads. The whole suburban dream package dropped right into what used to be farmland. And ever since that project started expanding toward my property line, things had been a little tense. Nothing dramatic at first, just small stuff. Survey flags appearing in odd places. Construction trucks drifting a little too close to my access road. Once I even had a foreman knock on my door asking if I'd consider relocating the water tower because it was visually inconsistent with the community aesthetic. Yeah, that was the phrase he used. I remember leaning against the doorframe thinking, you people built 200 identical beige houses in a row and my rusty farm tower is what ruins the view? I told him politely the tower wasn't moving. It was legally grandfathered under county code, and it sat fully inside my property boundary. Conversation over. Or so I thought. Fast forward a few weeks. I'm in Lisbon finishing up a meeting when my phone buzzes. Text message from Carl, the guy who owns the vineyard next door. Carl's the kind of neighbor who only messages if something is actually wrong. The photo loads slowly because the hotel Wi-Fi is terrible, and at first I can't even figure out what I'm looking at. It's a patch of brown dirt with tire tracks running across it. Then I see the metal scraps. Then the fence. Carl's message underneath the photo just says, "Hey, weren't you supposed to have a tower there?" For about 10 seconds my brain just refuses to process it. Because there are only 2 possibilities. Either the tower somehow collapsed on its own, which would have been a catastrophic structural failure, and probably half my irrigation system would already be flooded, or someone demolished it. And if someone demolished it, they did it on purpose. So I start making calls. First the county office, no demolition permit filed. Then the local inspector, no safety violation issued. Which leaves one obvious suspect. The developer. I email their site office, and about 4 hours later, I get a response from someone named Mark Dalton, Project Operations Manager. The email is only 4 sentences long. It basically says the structure had been removed due to safety concerns and potential interference with a construction access easement they intended to widen during grading operations. That's it. No apology. No prior notice. No paperwork attached. Just we removed it. Now here's the funny part about easements. An easement means someone has the right to pass through a piece of land. Maybe for a road, maybe for utilities. But it does not mean they suddenly own the land. And it definitely doesn't mean they get to destroy permanent structures sitting outside the easement boundary. My tower stood several feet inside my property line. Always had. So I asked Mark Dalton for documentation. He sends me a revised site map, one filed years after my original property plat, showing a widened access corridor cutting dangerously close to the corner where my tower used to stand. But maps don't rewrite property deeds. And mine was very clear, which meant one thing became obvious almost immediately. They hadn't removed the tower because it was unsafe. They removed it because it was inconvenient. And they probably timed it while I was overseas, hoping the delay would keep me from reacting quickly. Honestly, that part almost impressed me. Almost. Because instead of jumping on the next flight home, I decided to handle the situation exactly where I was, 6,000 miles away, sitting in a hotel room with terrible coffee and a very reliable internet connection. If they thought distance meant silence, they had seriously miscalculated. All right, before we jump back into the story, let me pause for a second because this is where a lot of people misunderstand how situations like this actually work. And honestly, that misunderstanding is exactly what developers like this count on. See, when most homeowners run into a construction company or a development project, there's this immediate psychological pressure. Big trucks, official-looking vests, people talking fast about permits and compliance, and site plans. It creates the impression that they must have the authority to do whatever they're doing. This is a psychological trap. The moment someone sounds official enough, people assume the legal groundwork must already exist. But according to standard procedure, that's not how property law works in the United States. Authority doesn't come from confidence or construction equipment. It comes from documentation. Permits, recorded easements, county approvals, and most importantly, the property deed. From a legal perspective, an easement is extremely specific. It grants a limited right, usually access or utilities, and that right is tightly defined by location and scope. It does not grant ownership, and it definitely doesn't grant the right to destroy permanent structures that sit outside the easement boundary. Now here's where it gets interesting. Developers operate on timelines and momentum. Every day a project stalls costs money, crews, equipment rentals, financing interest, all of it bleeding cash. So when they run into a physical obstacle, like, say, an inconvenient agricultural water tower sitting near their planned access route, the temptation is to treat that obstacle as something that will eventually get sorted out later. Sometimes they assume the owner won't fight it. Sometimes they assume the owner won't even notice. And sometimes, especially in rural areas, they assume the owner won't have the resources to push back legally. In other words, they roll the dice. And when they rolled the dice on my tower, they were betting on two things: distance and delay. What they didn't realize was that distance doesn't matter much anymore when you can assemble a legal response faster from a laptop than they can move a bulldozer. So there I am, sitting in a quiet hotel room in Lisbon, jet-lagged, staring at that photo Carl sent me, the empty dirt patch where my water tower used to stand. And the more I looked at it, the calmer I got. Not because I was happy about it, but because the situation was starting to look very clear. Someone had removed a permanent structure from private property without a permit, without notice, and without verifying the legal boundary. That's not a gray area. That's trespass and property destruction. And the moment I realized that, the whole strategy became obvious. Instead of panicking or booking the next flight home, I started making a list. First name on that list, a licensed land surveyor. I called a guy named Daniel Reyes, someone I'd worked with a couple years earlier when I remarked part of the orchard boundary. Good reputation, very methodical, the kind of surveyor who double-checks every marker like he's building a court case. Which, in this situation, he basically was. I explained what happened and sent him the photo. There was about a 5-second pause on the phone before he said something that made me smile. "Do you want the fast answer or the expensive answer?" I told him I wanted the documented answer. So 2 days later, Daniel was out on my property with a GPS survey rig, locating every boundary monument tied to my deed. Not guesswork, Not old fence lines. Actual recorded coordinates tied to county records. And he wasn't alone. Because the second call I made that morning was to a civil engineer named Laura Chan, someone who specialized in agricultural water systems. I sent her the same photo and asked one simple question. If someone destroys a load-bearing water tower that feeds an irrigation grid, what does reconstruction look like under modern code? Her response was immediate. More expensive than the original. Exactly what I wanted to hear. Within a few days, both of them had done their inspections. Daniel confirmed something critical. The tower had been standing roughly 6 feet inside my property boundary. Not on the easement. Not even close. But the real smoking gun was the ground itself. Heavy equipment tracks cut straight across the property corner, well beyond the easement corridor the developer claimed they were working within. Bulldozer tracks don't lie. Laura's report came next. She evaluated the destroyed system, calculated the load requirements for the irrigation network, and produced a full engineering estimate for a replacement tower that would meet current structural standards. And when I opened that estimate, I actually laughed out loud in the hotel room. Steel prices had gone up. Labor costs had gone up. Wind load requirements had changed since the 70s, which meant rebuilding that tower under modern code was going to cost a lot more than the original installation decades ago. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor. Now at this point, everything moved pretty quickly. I hired a local attorney, Marcus Holloway, calm guy, very precise with words, and we assembled what's called a formal demand letter. If you've never seen one of these, it's basically the legal version of saying, "We have the evidence, we know what you did, and here's the bill." Marcus included everything. The certified boundary survey, photographs of the demolished site, Laura's stamped engineering reconstruction estimate, and documentation explaining exactly how the irrigation disruption could stress orchard crops during peak watering cycles. The claims were straightforward. Trespass, property destruction, operational damages. And then we sent the letter to the developer's corporate office and to their insurance carrier. That last part is important, because developers might argue. Insurance companies don't like surprises. About 4 days later, I got the first real crack in their armor. Not from Mark Dalton, the guy who sent that casual little 4-sentence email earlier, but from the developer's insurance adjuster. Apparently, once the claim hit their desk, they started pulling equipment logs from the construction crews working that section of the site. And buried in those logs was a line that changed everything. The subcontractor operating the demolition equipment had received a work instruction that read, "Clear vertical obstructions in grading corridor." That's it. No verification of ownership. No boundary confirmation. Just remove obstacles. Which meant the crew never actually checked whether the tower belonged to the development property or the neighboring parcel. They just knocked it down. And once that instruction showed up in the documentation, liability snapped into focus like a spotlight. Insurance companies hate two things: unclear liability and courtroom juries. So suddenly the tone of communication changed dramatically. Within 10 days, the developer's insurance carrier agreed to place the full reconstruction amount into an escrow account. No drawn-out lawsuit. No public argument. Just money set aside to rebuild the tower exactly as specified in the engineer's report. And because Laura's estimate had included operational disruption to the irrigation system, they also covered compensation for crop stress during the weeks the tower had been offline. By the time my consulting contract wrapped up and I finally flew back to California, the situation on the ground looked completely different from the photo Carl had sent me. The temporary fence was gone. In its place sat a freshly poured concrete foundation with anchor bolts sticking up like steel teeth waiting for the structure above. The reconstruction crew was already assembling the new tower components nearby: bright galvanized steel, thicker supports, modern welds designed for higher wind loads. The new design was slightly taller than the original and capable of holding more water capacity, which meant the irrigation system would actually run more efficiently than before. Laura had also added a small upgrade I didn't originally ask for: digital pressure sensors tied to a remote monitoring unit. Now I could check system pressure from my phone instead of climbing the ladder like it was 1985. But my favorite detail was at the base. Daniel the surveyor had installed permanent boundary monuments, heavy brass markers embedded in concrete, surrounding the tower foundation at measured intervals. Anyone who ever walked near that corner of the property would now see very clearly where the legal line stood. And as for the developer, Well, their construction crews quietly rerouted the access road they were grading. The new route curved a little farther away from my property corner than their original plan. Nobody from Hawthorne Gates ever knocked on my door again asking about aesthetic concerns. Funny how that works. They assumed my absence meant silence. Instead, it bought them a larger invoice, a stronger tower, and a permanent reminder that property lines are not suggestions. Now here's the part people usually ask me when they hear this story. They say, "Weren't you furious?" And yeah, at first, absolutely. Seeing something that had stood on your land for decades reduced to scrap metal tends to trigger a pretty strong reaction. But after the initial shock wore off, something interesting happened. The anger turned into curiosity. Because situations like this aren't really about a water tower. They're about something much bigger. How people behave when they think nobody is watching. The lesson here is that a lot of conflicts around land, HOAs, or development projects don't actually start with evil masterminds sitting around plotting property crimes. Most of the time, it's a mix of pressure, assumptions, and a little bit of arrogance. Developers operate on schedules. Crews are told to clear obstacles. Managers assume the paperwork will catch up later. And somewhere along that chain of decisions, someone convinces themselves the landowner probably won't notice, or won't fight back, or won't have the time or resources to deal with it. That's the gamble. And honestly, sometimes that gamble works. Plenty of people come home, see something wrong on their property, and immediately feel overwhelmed. Big companies, legal language, construction timelines. It can feel like you're stepping into a system designed to push you aside. So they shrug, accept a half apology, maybe a small check, and life moves on. But here's where experience matters. According to standard procedure in property disputes, the strongest response is almost never the loudest response. It's the most documented one. Calmly assembling the right professionals, surveyors, engineers, attorneys, changes the entire dynamic. Suddenly the situation isn't a disagreement between neighbors anymore. It's a liability problem backed by evidence. And when liability enters the room, insurance companies start paying very close attention. From a legal perspective, property lines are one of the clearest boundaries in American law. Easements, zoning rules, HOA covenants. All of those can complicate things, but the recorded deed remains the backbone of ownership. When someone crosses that line without authorization, especially with heavy equipment, the law tends to respond pretty decisively. And there's another layer to this story that I think people overlook. Remember the developer's original email? For sentences. No apology, no conversation, just a confident statement that the structure had been removed for safety concerns. That tone tells you something important about the mindset behind the decision. They expected compliance. This is a psychological trap that shows up in HOA conflicts all the time. Authority language, words like compliance, safety, code enforcement, can make people second-guess themselves even when they're legally in the right. The moment someone sounds official enough, we instinctively assume they must know something we don't. But authority without documentation is just noise. And once you realize that, the entire situation changes. Because the real power in these disputes doesn't come from who has the bigger bulldozer or the bigger development budget. It comes from who understands the rules of the system better. The funny part is that the end result of this whole mess actually improved my property. The new tower is stronger, more efficient, and equipped with monitoring technology the original never had. The irrigation system runs smoother now. Even the boundary markers around the base will probably prevent future misunderstandings for decades. In a strange way, the developer accidentally upgraded my farm. But the bigger takeaway isn't about winning or losing. It's about awareness. Land ownership, whether it's a suburban house, a rural property, or something inside an HOA, comes with invisible lines that matter a lot more than most people realize. And those lines only stay protected if the owners understand them and are willing to defend them when necessary. So if there's one thing I'd tell anyone watching this, it's this. Keep copies of your surveys. Know where your easements actually sit. And if someone ever makes a big decision about your property without telling you first, slow down, gather the facts, and document everything before reacting. Because sometimes the smartest move isn't rushing home in anger. Sometimes the smartest move is sitting 6,000 miles away with a laptop and letting the paperwork do the talking. And now I'm curious about something. If you came home and discovered a developer had removed something from your property without permission, a fence, a shed, a tower, anything. What would your first move be? Would you confront them directly, call the county, or start gathering evidence the way I did? Let me know what you'd do. I read more of those comments than you'd probably expect.